The security footage would be replayed for the rest of his life. In boardrooms, in courtrooms, in his own mind at 3 in the morning, when sleep refused to come. A woman on her knees at gate 14, a 4-year-old boy convulsing in her arms. She was screaming one word, "Doctor," over and over, while airport staff moved toward her with a speed that didn't look like chaos. It looked like something rehearsed, something they had been trained for. And walking away from her without turning around was her husband. "I'm done," he said. "Figure it out yourself." He didn't know that in 48 hours, that woman's face would appear on every screen in that terminal, announced as the new president of the very airline whose planes were taking off above his head at that exact moment. He didn't know he had just humiliated himself in front of his own future. He didn't know, because for 10 years, the woman he married had let him believe she was nobody. This is the story of the day the truth finally caught up to him, and the story of everything 10 years earlier that led them both to that gate. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. Daniel Reyes was 29 years old, with hands permanently stained by jet fuel and calluses that never fully healed. He worked the tarmac at Meridian International as a ground mechanic, one of the men nobody thanks, the ones who make sure a plane is safe before a single passenger ever boards it. He grew up the son of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night. As a boy, he fell asleep in the back seat of her old car in empty parking garages, waiting for her shift to end. He remembered the cold vinyl seats. He remembered pretending to be asleep so she wouldn't feel guilty. And he remembered making himself a quiet promise, somewhere around age 9, that whatever family he built one day would never feel that kind of exhaustion, that kind of invisibility. So when Daniel finally landed a stable union job at the airport, he treated it like something sacred. He arrived early. He stayed late. He fixed the things other mechanics gave up on. Supervisors trusted him with jobs they wouldn't hand to men twice his age. Co-workers borrowed money from him without worrying whether they'd be judged for it, because Daniel never made anyone feel small for needing help. He wasn't a man who chased attention, he was a man who showed up. What Daniel never knew was that the day he met Elena wasn't an accident at all. For weeks before they met, she had been quietly watching him from the observation deck of the executive lounge, a place ordinary staff never had access to, while visiting her father, who was recovering from a minor procedure at a private clinic connected to the airport. She noticed the way Daniel treated the newest, least experienced baggage handler with the exact same respect he gave his supervisor. She noticed he never raised his voice, even when a plane was delayed and everyone around him was panicking. She asked someone, gently, quietly, to arrange for their paths to cross. It happened at a small cafe outside Terminal B. His coffee order got mixed up. She offered him hers. "You looked like you needed it more than me," she said, smiling. He had no idea that the woman apologizing over a cup of coffee was heir to a $10 billion aviation empire. And she liked it that way. For the first time in her adult life, someone was looking at her. Not her name. She introduced herself as Elena Marquez, her mother's maiden name. Not the Calderón name printed on the tails of hundreds of aircraft around the world. It felt to her like a small lie. Harmless. A woman simply wanting to be seen for herself. She had no idea how much that single omission would cost them both, years later, at a gate neither of them could yet imagine. 3 months into dating, Daniel came home to find an envelope on his doorstep, a luxury watch inside, no note attached. He assumed it was a gift from her, a woman who clearly came from some money, though he still believed it was comfortable money, not empire money. He drove 2 hours the next day to return it to the store. He refused to accept something he hadn't earned. What he didn't know was that Elena had sent it herself, deliberately, without explanation. It was a quiet test, to see whether the man who claimed not to care about wealth actually meant it. When he returned it, she sat in her car outside the store and cried, watching him through the window walk out with empty hands and a full heart. She had found the man her father always warned her she would never find. Elena Calderón had spent her entire life being groomed for a throne she never asked to sit on. Her father, Ricardo Calderón, had built Aurora Wings from 4 second-hand cargo planes into one of the largest airline holding companies in the Americas. Elena grew up in boardrooms instead of playgrounds. She could read a balance sheet before she could ride a bicycle without training wheels. Every friend she had as a child, she later suspected, had been quietly vetted, approved, chosen, never simply met. By 26, she was exhausted by a life where nothing felt earned and nothing felt entirely real. Every compliment came with a question mark attached. Do they mean it, or do they mean my last name? Meeting Daniel felt like the first breath of fresh air she'd taken in years. When they married, it was a small courthouse ceremony. No family, no cameras, no fanfare. Daniel assumed it meant she came from a broken, uncaring family, and some old wound in him, the memory of his own absent father, made him quietly, tenderly protective of her because of it. The truth was different. Her father had spent that entire week in emergency negotiations, desperately trying to keep tabloids from connecting his daughter's wedding to a blue-collar airport mechanic before she was ready to make that announcement on her own terms. His absence wasn't rejection. It was protection, badly executed, wrapped in the kind of silence rich families use instead of conversation. 6 months after the wedding, Ricardo offered Elena the position of executive vice president, a direct path toward one day running the entire company. She turned it down. She never told Daniel the offer had existed at all. She wanted, more than any title, a life where she came home to a small apartment and cooked dinner with a man who had no idea what she was worth in dollars. She traded a boardroom for a kitchen table and never once mentioned the trade, because mentioning it meant admitting what she still might, one day, be forced to take back. The first cracks appeared quietly, the way most cracks do. Daniel, insecure about providing enough on a mechanic's salary, would go tense whenever they passed a luxury dealership, or when the news covered another Calderon Airlines merger. "People like that don't know what real work looks like," he'd mutter, not realizing he was insulting the woman lying beside him in bed. Elena would go quiet each time, swallowing the words rising in her throat. If you only knew. She told herself she would explain everything eventually. She kept telling herself that for 10 years. She loved him too much to risk watching his face change. And so, without meaning to, the woman who had once been groomed for a throne spent a decade quietly, deliberately shrinking herself, so the man she loved could feel tall. Daniel wasn't born a villain. That's what made everything that followed so much harder to watch. The real turning point in him began the year Elena got pregnant, the same month her father's health started seriously declining, and the same month Ricardo began quietly pressuring her to prepare for succession. Overwhelmed, terrified of losing him and her father in the same season of her life, Elena decided to postpone telling Daniel any of it until after the baby is born. She told herself it was about timing. In truth, it was fear. Fear of watching his face change the moment he learned who she really was. Daniel, meanwhile, began noticing small things he couldn't explain, unexplained absences, phone calls taken behind closed doors, a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Instead of asking her directly, instead of simply sitting down and saying something feels different, talk to me, Daniel began quietly building his own private theory. He started checking her phone while she showered. He started timing her grocery trips, counting the minutes like evidence in a case only he was building. Not out of cruelty, out of an old wound. A boy who once watched his father disappear without warning was now, as a man, terrified of the same thing happening to him. So terrified that he stopped trusting his own wife's face. Their son Mateo was born healthy, but at age 3, he began having sudden, unexplained seizures. A condition doctors struggled for months to properly diagnose. Elena began flying secretly and frequently to specialists in 3 different countries, using private medical transport quietly arranged through her family's company. Resources Daniel had no idea existed. To him, it looked like a woman disappearing for days with vague explanations. He didn't see a mother fighting silently and desperately to save her son's life. He saw a woman he no longer recognized. And a man who cannot recognize the woman he loves will eventually start writing a stranger's story onto her face. The first real fracture came on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel found a business-class boarding pass tucked inside the pocket of her coat, a class of ticket that cost more than his entire monthly salary. She had told him, weeks earlier, that she flew economy to save money for Mateo's treatments. He didn't confront her that night. He didn't sit her down, take her hand, and ask the question calmly, the way partners are supposed to when something doesn't add up. Instead, he told a coworker at the hangar, loud enough for two other men to hear, "My wife's spending money we don't have. I don't even know where it's coming from anymore." He had no idea the money was hers. All of it, always had been. He had simply never once asked the right question. Elena tried, twice that year, to finally tell him the truth. The first time on the anniversary of Mateo's diagnosis, she sat him down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling around a mug of tea. "There's something about my family I never explained properly," she began. Before she could say another word, Mateo started crying from the next room, his fever spiking without warning. The conversation dissolved into a midnight hospital run, and the truth was swallowed by an emergency, the way it always seemed to be. The second attempt came months later. She had rehearsed the words in the mirror that morning. But halfway through dinner, a call came in from her father's hospice nurse, and the moment collapsed again. The truth kept losing to emergencies, and Daniel's suspicion kept winning the silence left behind. "Why do you always take those calls in another room?" he asked one night, arms crossed. "It's private family business, Daniel. Please, not tonight." "Private from your own husband?" She looked at him for a long moment, aching to say everything, and said nothing at all. "I'll explain when I can." "You always say that." By the time Mateo's condition worsened enough to require constant monitoring and travel to a specialized neurological unit across the country, the very trip that would end at that airport gate, Daniel had already built an entire narrative in his head. His wife was hiding money, hiding a second life, maybe even hiding another man. Every unexplained flight, every hushed phone call, every impossibly expensive doctor she somehow afforded, all of it fit perfectly into the story he had quietly written for her, one suspicious night at a time. He never once considered the simplest explanation, that she was telling the truth, and he had simply never given her the room to say it out loud. What new secret was Elena still carrying? One even bigger than the money? And how long could a marriage survive on a decade of almost truths? The morning of the airport incident, Daniel didn't go to say goodbye to his wife and son. He went to catch her. A co-worker, trying to be helpful, mentioned she'd overheard Elena on the phone the night before saying, "The driver will meet me at gate 14. Daniel, already certain the driver meant another man, arrived at the airport early. He didn't announce himself. He hid near a coffee kiosk across the terminal, watching his own wife and son through a crowd of strangers. The man helping Elena with the luggage wasn't a lover. It was Hassan, her company-assigned driver and personal security escort. Standard protocol for any Calderon family member traveling with a minor requiring medical transport. Daniel, watching from across the terminal, saw only a well-dressed stranger placing a gentle, protective hand on his wife's back to guide her through the crowd. His entire body went cold with a certainty that was completely, catastrophically wrong. He stormed across the terminal just as Mateo's seizure began. The boy collapsed mid-sentence, his small body convulsing against the polished floor. Elena dropped to her knees, screaming for help, her voice cracking with a terror only a mother understands. In that same instant, airport staff who recognized her from an internal memo, quietly circulated that week, announcing her as the incoming president of Aurora Wings, began responding with a speed and coordination that had nothing to do with ordinary emergency protocol. Radios crackled. A medical team appeared within 90 seconds. Someone was already calling ahead to a hospital. Daniel, blind with jealousy and adrenaline, mistook their urgency for something else entirely. Proof in his mind that this was staged. Exaggerated. For attention. A performance meant to distract him from asking who Hassan really was. "I'm done," he said, over the sound of his own son's convulsions. "Figure it out yourself." He turned. He walked away. Elena's scream followed him down the terminal, but he didn't turn around. Not once. Behind him, a woman he had loved for 10 years knelt on an airport floor, holding their dying son, surrounded by strangers who somehow, impossibly, knew exactly who she was. while the one man who was supposed to know her better than anyone on earth had just proven in front of 100 witnesses that he never really knew her at all. That night, sitting alone in a bar 3 miles from the airport, Daniel stared at a muted television bolted above the counter. A breaking local news segment scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Aurora Wings announces new president, Elena Calderón, to take helm following father's retirement. He almost didn't look up. Then he saw the photograph. It was her, his wife, standing beside her father in a photo that had clearly been taken weeks earlier, both of them smiling for cameras Daniel never knew existed in her world. His beer glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Nobody in the bar noticed. He sat frozen, staring at a stranger wearing his wife's face. Desperate, he called the hospital where Mateo had been taken, demanding information as the boy's father. He was told, politely but firmly, that he wasn't listed on the authorized contact protocol for that patient, a detail quietly updated that same afternoon by the company's family security office. Not out of malice, standard practice whenever a Calderón family emergency became publicly visible. To Daniel, it felt like being erased from his own son's life in real time. "This is his father," Daniel said into the phone, his voice cracking. "You have to let me see him." "I'm sorry, sir, I don't have authorization to release any information." He called Elena's phone next, hands shaking. A stranger answered, a company attorney assigned to accompany her that evening. "Is her father even alive?" Daniel asked, panic overtaking him. "She told me he died years ago." There was a pause on the line. "Ricardo Calderón is very much alive, sir. He's the one who called this meeting tonight." Daniel sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the call ended, realizing that an entire decade of his marriage was full of gaps he had never once thought to question. He thought of every dinner where she'd gone quiet, every private family business call taken behind a closed door. Every time he'd told himself he already understood the whole picture. He had understood almost nothing. 2 days later, unable to reach anyone, Daniel returned to their apartment and found an old shoebox in the back of the closet. Something he'd always assumed held nothing more than old photographs. Inside was a letter, dated the day of their courthouse wedding. It had never been sent. In it, Elena had written the truth she could never quite find the courage to say out loud. Her real name, her father's company, her fear that if Daniel knew, he would fall in love with the empire instead of her. Or worse, resent her for the very safety it could have given their family. "I wanted one person in my life who chose me before he knew what I was worth," she had written. "I'm scared that by the time I finally tell you, it will feel less like a gift and more like a confession." Daniel sat on the floor of their apartment and read it 3 times, the weight of it slowly crushing the version of the last 10 years he thought he understood. He wasn't married to a liar. He was married to a woman who had been so afraid of losing him, she had buried the very thing that could have saved them both. Years of honesty, traded for a fear that never came true until the day he made it come true himself. A former coworker, someone Daniel had known for years, finally said what half the airport apparently already suspected. "You really didn't know?" the man asked, almost gently. "Some of the senior staff have known who she was for over a year. Her father visits the executive lounge every few months. We figured you knew and just didn't care about the money. That's why we respected you so much." The humiliation wasn't just personal anymore, it was public, retroactive. It had been sitting there unspoken in plain sight for months, and somewhere across the city, in a hospital room he wasn't allowed into. His son was fighting for his life without him. The security footage, meant to stay strictly internal, leaked accidentally through a junior compliance employee who forwarded it to the wrong department distribution list. Within days, clips of Daniel walking away from his convulsing son were circulating quietly inside Aurora Wings corporate offices. Not on social media, not publicly, but among people who now knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had done. Executives who had never met him whispered his name in hallways. Assistants exchanged glances when Elena walked by. Daniel was let go from his position at Meridian International less than 2 weeks later, not out of retaliation from Elena. She never made a single call, never asked for it. But because his employment had technically created a conflict of interest flag the moment his connection to Aurora Wing's new president became known company-wide, he lost his job for a reason that had nothing and everything to do with her. Alone, unemployed, and desperate for any information about his son, Daniel finally learned through a mutual acquaintance that Mateo's condition had significantly improved, thanks to an experimental treatment program available only through a private medical research partnership Aurora Wings had quietly funded for months. The same wife he had accused of hiding secrets and money had spent countless nights secretly moving mountains to save their son's life, using resources Daniel never knew existed, while he sat in bars and hallways building a case against her in his own head. The shame hit him harder than any accusation ever could have. He drove past the hospital 3 times that week, unable to make himself walk through the front doors. He didn't know what he was more afraid of, being turned away again or being let in and having to face what he'd done under fluorescent light, with no crowd to hide behind. He started writing letters he never sent, apologies that felt too small for what had happened. He would write a paragraph, read it back, and tear it up, convinced that no combination of words could undo a video that now existed forever. A husband walking away from his own dying son. For the first time in his life, Daniel understood what it felt like to be the person everyone had quietly decided they were right to judge. A local journalist, having caught wind of the leaked footage, reached out to Daniel offering him a chance to tell his side. For a moment Daniel believed this might be his redemption, a way to explain the confusion, the insecurity, the years of small silences on both sides that had led them both to that gate. He agreed to a phone call, but in their very first conversation the journalist's questions revealed the truth. This wasn't about fairness, it was about a headline. "Can you confirm you told her to figure it out herself while your son was seizing?" the journalist asked, voice clipped, already typing. "Our readers are going to want to know. Did you know about her fortune before you married her, or after?" Daniel realized in that instant what it felt like to be reduced to a story instead of understood as a person, the exact thing Elena had spent her whole life trying to avoid. He declined the interview, digging through old news archives afterward, driven by guilt more than curiosity. Daniel discovered something that broke him completely. In the 2 weeks since the incident, despite having the power and the platform to destroy his reputation publicly and permanently, Elena had given no interviews, made no public statements, instructed her legal team, in writing, to keep his name out of every press release the company issued. She had every reason in the world to expose him. She had chosen silence instead. He sat with that fact for a long time. A woman with $10 billion and every legal and financial weapon imaginable had chosen not to use a single one of them against him. Not out of weakness, out of something he was only now beginning to understand. He finally understood what 10 years of loving someone quietly, without demanding anything in return, actually looked like. And he understood, with a sickening clarity, that he had spent those same 10 years assuming the worst about a woman who had spent them protecting him, even from herself. Daniel requested through the company's family liaison office a formal meeting, not for reconciliation he told himself, but simply to see his son. Some small, hopeful part of him expected a dramatic confrontation, tears, shouting, forgiveness offered too easily, the way it happens in the stories he used to half believe growing up. Instead, he was seated across a long conference table from Elena and 2 attorneys, in a room that felt colder and more professional than anything he had imagined for this moment. She looked different, not colder, steadier, like a woman who had finally stopped shrinking. "I'm not here to punish you," she said, her voice calm and measured, the voice of someone who had learned long ago how to hold a room without raising it. "I'm here to figure out what's safest and healthiest for Mateo. That's the only agenda on this table." The distance in her voice hurt more than anger ever could have. "Elena, he started. "I read your letters," she said quietly, cutting him off, not unkindly but firmly. "The ones you never sent. Hassan found them in a folder on the shared family drive, flagged by security. I read every one of them 3 times. Daniel's throat tightened. "Then you know I know you're sorry," she said. I've known that for 2 weeks. Sorry isn't the part I've been struggling with. Then what is? Ah! She looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded crossing her face for the first time since he'd walked into the room. The part where you looked at 10 years of me choosing you, every single day in 100 small ways you never noticed, and decided, in one terrifying afternoon, that I was the one who'd been lying about who I really was. He had no answer for that. There wasn't one. As the meeting was ending, a soft knock interrupted them. It was Matteo, thinner than Daniel remembered, walking carefully with a small cane for balance, but alive, alert, and improving every day. "Is Papa staying for dinner?" the boy asked, looking straight past the attorneys, straight past the tension in the room, directly at his father. Not Elena, not the lawyers. The boy himself was the one pulling his father back into the family's orbit, innocent of everything that had been said and misunderstood between the two adults who loved him most. Daniel broke down in front of the entire room. That evening, Elena agreed to speak with him alone, in the small garden behind the family estate. The first real conversation they'd had in months, away from lawyers, away from cameras, away from the weight of who she now officially was to the rest of the world. "I built a whole story about who you were," Daniel admitted, his voice shaking. "A driver helping you with your bags, a blocked number, business class tickets you couldn't explain. I turned every gap into proof that you were hiding something ugly, and the entire time you were hiding something you were ashamed to be proud of." Elena looked at him for a long time before answering. "Do you know why I never told you?" "Because you thought I'd love the money instead of you." "At first, yes," she said, "but it stopped being about that a long time ago, Daniel. I stopped telling you because every year that passed made the silence feel bigger than the truth. It got harder, not easier. I was so afraid of the moment you found out that I spent a decade delaying it, and in the end you found out in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment, in front of our sick son." "I should have asked you," he said, "instead of building a case against you like you were a stranger, like you were the enemy." "Yes," she said simply, "you should have." The honesty of it landed harder than any accusation could have. There was no comfort offered, no easy forgiveness handed over to smooth the moment. Just the truth, sitting quietly between them, the way it always should have. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight," Daniel said. "I don't think I'd forgive me tonight, if I were you." "I haven't decided what I feel yet," Elena admitted. "I know I don't hate you. I know Matteo needs his father, whatever happens between us. And I know that for the first time in 10 years there's nothing left unsaid between us. That has to count for something." For the first time since the gate, since the shoebox, since the phone call that shattered everything he thought he knew, Daniel let himself believe that maybe, not easily, not quickly, but maybe, there was still something worth rebuilding. Karma in the end didn't arrive the way Daniel expected. It didn't come as a lightning bolt or a public shaming orchestrated by a woman with every resource to deliver one. It came quietly, the way real consequences usually do. He lost the job he had loved and built his entire identity around. Not from cruelty, but from the simple, unavoidable weight of who his wife had become. He lost the trust of co-workers who had once respected him precisely because they believed he'd known the truth all along and chosen love anyway. When the real story came out, that he hadn't known, and worse, that he'd walked away from his seizing son believing she was hiding an affair, the same men who once admired him grew quiet whenever he entered a room. He spent weeks unemployed, applying for mechanic positions at smaller airports, sitting through interviews where hiring managers occasionally recognized his face from the leaked footage and found polite reasons not to call him back. He lost for a period of months unsupervised time with his own son, not from malice but from a family protection protocol automatically triggered the moment airport security footage of a public abandonment reached internal compliance. A system that didn't know he was a frightened, insecure husband. It only knew what the camera had recorded. He lost, most painfully, the version of himself he had always believed he was. The good man, the trustworthy one, the one who showed up. For the first time in his life, Daniel had to sit with the reality that being a hard worker, a loyal friend, And a devoted son didn't automatically make him a safe place for the people who depended on him most. Ricardo Calderon, watching his daughter and grandson from his hospital bed, never once demanded that Daniel be punished, exposed, or removed from their lives. When a board member privately suggested using the incident to quietly force Daniel out of the family altogether, Ricardo refused. "My daughter didn't marry a monster," he told them. "She married a man with a wound he never healed. That's not a crime. It's a warning we should have taken more seriously, sooner, all of us." Justice, in this story, wasn't cruelty repaid with cruelty. It was simply the truth, finally allowed to stand in the light, and a man forced for the first time to face the exact size and shape of what his silence and suspicion had cost. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the doorway of Mateo's room, watching his son build a tower of wooden blocks on the floor, laughing at how quickly it toppled over. He didn't live in the family estate. He hadn't asked to, and Elena hadn't offered, not yet. He rented a small apartment 15 minutes away, took a mechanic's job at a regional airport that had never heard of Aurora Wings or the video that once defined him, and showed up, without fail, every single week for supervised time that had slowly, carefully, become unsupervised again. He and Elena weren't back together. Not in the way the world might have wanted, tidy and immediate, wrapped up with a bow for an ending. Some nights she still looked at him, and he could see the gate behind her eyes, the sound of Mateo's small body against the terminal floor, the sight of her husband's back as he walked away. But some nights, she also looked at him the way she used to, like someone choosing to see the whole person instead of the worst 5 minutes of his life. "I used to think love meant never having to explain yourself," Elena told him one evening, watching Mateo sleep through the crack in his bedroom door. "I know now that's exactly backwards. Love is choosing to explain yourself, especially when it's terrifying. Especially when there's a chance the truth changes everything." Daniel nodded slowly. "And I used to think loyalty meant never asking hard questions, like asking meant I didn't trust you enough. And now? Now I think silence was never loyalty," he said. "It was just fear, wearing a nicer word." They stood together in the hallway, two people who had spent a decade almost knowing each other, one hiding a truth out of fear, the other building a lie out of suspicion. Finally choosing, slowly and imperfectly, to close the distance they had both quietly allowed to grow. Mateo, from his bed, mumbled something in his sleep and rolled over, safe, healthy, and utterly unaware of how close his family had come to losing everything over things that were never said out loud. Somewhere above the house, a plane crossed the night sky, its lights blinking steadily against the dark. One of hundreds bearing the Calderon name, carrying strangers toward places they had never been. Daniel watched it disappear over the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel small standing beneath it. He felt simply like a man who had finally learned the one lesson his whole life had been trying to teach him, that the people we love rarely lie to hurt us. More often, they stay silent because they're afraid, and the greatest damage isn't done by the secret itself, but by everything we assume in the space where honesty should have been.
Moral of the story: honesty and communication are the strongest foundations of any relationship. When people hide the truth out of fear or make assumptions without asking questions, misunderstandings grow until they cause deep pain. Elena kept her identity a secret because she wanted to be loved for who she was, while Daniel allowed suspicion and insecurity to replace trust. Instead of talking openly with his wife, he believed his own assumptions, which led him to make a terrible decision when his family needed him the most. His actions showed that judging others without knowing the full truth can have life-changing consequences. Another important lesson is that wealth and status do not define a person's character. Elena remained humble, loving, and devoted despite her immense fortune, proving that kindness is more valuable than money. The story also reminds us that forgiveness is a difficult process that requires sincere remorse, patience, and change. Most importantly, we should always communicate honestly, ask questions before making conclusions, and stand by our loved ones during difficult times. Trust is built through openness, and once it is broken, it takes great effort to rebuild. True love is not only about caring for someone, but also about believing in them, supporting them, and choosing understanding over suspicion.